Let's have a look at this position. How do you evaluate this? Black to play? What is your intuition telling you? Which side would you pick in a practical game and why? And which plan would you engage with the black pieces in this position? I will return back to this position by the end of this video and ask you once again about your observations. Okay, folks, let's begin. Today we are talking about a very important concept in chess, the minority attack. Namely, using our pawns to create weaknesses in the enemy position, create weak pawns which we can later attack. I will show you the mechanics of the minority attack which you can apply in vastly different pawn structures. That's the goal of learning. I want to teach you those core skills that is transferable to vastly different pawn structures. It's idea-based training. We will break it down to its core, always asking why this plan works in chess. Let's begin with a standard example, very standard Carlsbad pawn structure. White has the extra e pawn while black has the extra c pawn. What is the target of attack for the white pieces? It's not easy to find, right? The base pawn is on b7 on the queen side. This is the pawn that guards both of these guys, but it's very difficult for white to put pressure on the pawn on b7, right? The base is nicely protecting these two guys. It's a nice pawn chain for black, but it's not easy at all for white to put pressure on the concrete targets on the queen side. We must first create that target. We must first play with our pawns to create a weakness in the position, namely a weak pawn. Please tell me one good looking plan for white that achieves that goal. And the plan is b4, b5, folks. Once b5 is on the board, inevitably a weak pawn will be created in the black's camp, which is easier for white pieces to target. That's the core lesson of this plan of the minority attack. Why? Because white has 2 pawns versus 3 pawns on the queen side. This is why it's called the minority attack in chess. 2 pawns are hitting 3 pawns for the sole purpose of ultimately creating a weak pawn in the black's position. How is that possible? Let's say takes. Yes, black activated rook on the a file, but there are no clear targets yet for that rook to show its teeth. Plus, now it becomes obvious, if it's white's turn, I will take on c6, be leaving you with this weak pawn on c6, which I can later target with my pieces, right? If you take on b5, folks, you see, after rook takes b5, we created 2 weak pawns. These 2 pawns are now much easier to exploit for the white pieces, especially the guy on d5 became isolated. They can't even hold the pawn anymore, right? White is winning the pawn by force in this position. Either this one or this one is falling. You see, that's why we push b5. If they play c5, folks, the same problem. The d5 pawn becomes isolated and white will take on c5, they will take on f6, and they will take on d5. White simply won a pawn in the process, thanks to the minority attack. So after the very standard b4, b5, black is facing some issues, some long-term positional issues, because if black doesn't react to this move, for example, bishop f5, white will take on c6, and now, you see, that pawn is much easier to attack by the white pieces than the one on b7. Please compare this position with the initial position, right? It was much more difficult for white to put pressure on the pawn on b7. We were lacking concrete targets, and only after 3 moves, as you can see here, this guy is exploitable. How? Very simple. Knight e5, the knight is centralized while putting pressure on the pawn on c6. Not only the pawn itself, but the square itself is becoming weak in some sense, right? White can even use that square later on with their pieces because there is no more a pawn on b7 supporting that square. Meanwhile, you also activate your rook, of course. That's the final point of the minority attack plan. That's the final point of pushing b5. The rook also get active in the process. For example, rook c8, already it's good for white that that active rook is tied down on that pawn. You see, never forget this. The final point, maybe the real point of creating a weak pawn and attacking that weak pawn like this is to tie down the opponent's pieces. They are turning into passive pieces in the process. Rook b7, invade the 7th rank. Here, white is already having a big advantage. For example, takes. Their long-term problems remain. they can't even play c5 because this guy is lacking support in the process, right? Rook c1, for example, very nice move, aligning with the queen, aligning with the pawn on c6. White has a clear advantage. We can stop here. There are many games won by the white players in this exact pawn structure by the help of this very exact plan of b4, b5. Indeed, if you go 3 moves before, now you can also understand why white players in this Carlsbad formation first play rook b1 and then prepare this plan of b4, b5, right? Once you understand why it works and what's the final function of that plan, now all the previous moves start to make sense for you as well. I'm giving you these great tools for middle game plan making as well. For example, yeah, b4, very simple. I want to go b5 and create a weakness. If you play a6, I can prepare it. In the long run, black cannot stop that. Black can play b5. The problem is this leaves the pawn on c6 as a weak pawn as well. Knight e5 hits the pawn and white gets great play against the pawn on c6. You see, it's not easy at all for black to stop this. Of course, black has ways in their disposal to fight against this plan, but if all goes well for white, that's the desired state. Now you also understand, by the way, folks, why many players commit chess crimes in those pawn formations. For example, c6, exchange Caro-Kann leads to Carlsbad pawn formation. Now we are looking with the reversed colors. It's black who has ideas on the queen side to play a6, b5 and b4 and so on to create a weakness. But here, white player commits a chess crime by going b4. That's an amateur game, online game, and those decisions always interest me because it shows lack of true understanding of these middle games. By going b4, white is voluntarily creating a weak pawn on c3. Can you see it, folks? In some sense, white is saying black, you don't even need the minority attack. I am giving you this weakness on c3. So please tell me a good plan for black. Please make a move that ultimately prepares to attack the weakness on c3. Simple chess. Rook c8 is a great move, guys. Aligning against the pawn on c3, asking white a very simple question of how to deal with this weakness on c3. And yes, that's a weakness on c3. Why? Because that's an exploitable weakness. Black can put pressure later on that pawn, and that will tie down the white pieces forever, right? In the actual game, they played the move a6, incorrect. Why? Because b5 was never a threat. After rook c8, if they go b5, folks, we will go knight a5 and we'll thank white for giving us one more weakness on c4, and we are maneuvering our knight on this beautiful outpost on c4. Can you see it? The final problem behind the move b4 is white also created a weakness on c4. They lend us a weak square on c4, which we want to exploit if they commit further crimes like b5, because b5 also invites knight a5, and the knight is heading to the outpost on c4. Just look at this, guys. This rook is hitting on the weak pawn on c3, and the knight is hitting on the outpost on c4. So that's a secret sauce, ultimately, to beat weaker players. If you give them choices, they tend to commit such positional chess crimes, and then you play simple chess. You simply orient your pieces towards freshly created weaknesses, and the game plays itself. Please tell me a good move for white in this position, folks. How should white play in this position? Apply the minority attack concept to this position. Folks, again, if you look at the queen side, it's not easy at all for the white pieces to put pressure on the pawns on b6 and a7. That pawn is nicely guarding the one on b6. Yes, we have the semi-open b file, but there's no target to attack for our rooks. Thus, you're seeing this plan of a5, right? Very simple chess. Again, why is this called a minority attack? Because white is 1 versus 2 on the queen side. In some sense, these two pawns are weak because they cannot be supported by any other white pawn. So we are also getting rid of the potential weakness on a4 by pushing a5. After a5, it becomes obvious, I guess, that black needs to give us a concession. If they don't react, we will take on b6 and we'll create a weakness on b6 to attack. And if they take on a5, folks, you see, this pawn and this pawn became much more easy targets for our pieces. We can even double up our rooks, maybe even triple up our heavy pieces and pile up on that pawn on a7. We can even play rook a6 to attack the guy on d6. This definitely is an improvement to white's position. In this position, folks, if black played a5 to stop a5 from white, what's the problem? The problem is the pawn on b6. You simply play moves like rook a2 or maybe queen b2 and pile up against the weakness on b6, right? So a4 is a beautiful move. We can even go one move back in this position. If you go like a couple of moves earlier, then you start to understand the strength of such plan of a4, a5, which is quite standard in this very pawn formation. And you must always ask yourself, why is white playing like this? The ultimate goal is to create a weak pawn on the queen side, right? The moment there's a contact between those pawns, it's inevitable black will give a concession in this position. One more position. I love this one. White to play. Please find a beautiful plan for white in this position. Go deeper, stop the video, look at the imbalances, and then one plan should spring to your mind, hopefully. Folks, let's do it together. White has the bishop pair, and this bishop is the unopposed bishop. White has a light square bishop, black doesn't have a light square bishop. In those positions, the goal, the strategic goal should be, how do I increase the influence of my unopposed bishop? Right? Very logical, because if you start creating play on those light squares, well, your bishop can shine because the guy has no light square bishop in that position. Right now, this pawn chain seems to be blunting our bishop on f3, and one natural plan for white is to disturb and destroy this pawn chain to activate the bishop on f3. So given this orientation phase, one thing should spring to your mind as a very natural plan for white. And the plan involves b4. What's the point? You want to go b5 and to disturb the pawn chain and to activate your bishop on f3. b4 is also kind of a minority attack if you pay attention because, well, two pawns are rolling against those three, and even those pawns are, let's say, weak pawns in the process. You also want to get rid of your weak pawns on the queen side while disturbing black's nice setup on the queen side. This also involves some tactical vision because it looks like, hey, black can go a6 and completely clamp down on your b5 plan. But now comes my question. What should white play, folks? Have you seen the alignment between the rooks? Have you seen the rook on a8 is a loose piece? 0 attackers, 0 defenders. Thus, we go b5 anyway because the pawn cannot capture on b5. Thus, black needs to take back with the c pawn, but at the very least, we can take on b7 with the bishop and we'll take on a6 on the next turn, or after rook b8, let's say, we can even do bishop c6 first and then we take on a6. White is getting a winning advantage in this position. Just look at our pieces. The bishop is shining. We'll be winning a pawn. This pawn will become weak as well. Everything went in white's favor here. So after b4, black cannot play a6. But then, let's say they go knight c7. Can they really stop us from playing b5? That's my question to you. White to play and win. Boom, b5 anyhow. We're also learning to activate our pieces using beautiful pawn breaks in this video, right? Well, the point is if you take on b5 with the pawn, bishop takes b7, the bishop is shining, and you will take on a7 on the next turn. We couple up a pawn. Our pieces are beautiful. That's also a weakness on b5. No counterplay. The knight is terrible. This bishop is terrible. White is completely winning in this position. So b4 is the only move that wins for white. Incredible. White's minority attack is indeed a winning plan in this position because black is not organized yet to stop b4, b5, and what an explosive pawn break that is, right? That basically destroys the pawn chain, activates the bishop, creates a weakness on b7. Also in the process, our rook is becoming beautiful on the a file. So we also call these explosive pawn breaks. You see, white is using their dynamical advantage, namely better development, better pieces to attack when the iron is hot. If white keeps on waiting, let's say you make some routine moves, black will play knight c7, they will connect their rooks, and now it's already too late with b4, b5 because black will play a6, you see, and they are stopping your b5 idea. This means your bishop is also blunted in this position. Black is gaining stability in this position. It will be difficult for white to claim an advantage in this position. So what we also learned in this position is sometimes timing of our pawn breaks is a crucial factor in chess. But you see, the process is to always look at pawn play in terms of piece activity and weakness creation. Now we are back in square one. We've seen all these positions. I'm asking you once again, who is better and why? And can you formulate a good plan for black in this position? I'm expecting your feedback on YouTube. This is your homework position. Now, after you go through those positions, the intuition should grow and you should have a better understanding of this position. At least a couple of good plans should spring to your mind, for white or for black. I want you to lay down those ideas to me on YouTube by leaving a comment. You see, you learn best from forming connections. This video allows you to form connection between pawn play, weakness creation, tying down the pieces, and attacking weaknesses in chess. These are the pillars of chess strategy, right? Improving our pieces by simply hitting weaknesses is a great strategic tool that you can apply to vastly different positions. And that's the goal of my channel, to give you those tools that is the highest chance of applications in vastly different positions and not only in a particular pawn formation, right? As a teacher, I am very much into these kind of broadly applicable skills that make you an overall better chess player. I hope you liked the episode, folks. Please give me a like if you did so, and I will catch you in another video on plan making, pawn play, and chess strategy. See you soon.